My name is Emily Baker. I'm the interim curator at the Art Gallery of St. Albert, and it is my absolute pleasure to present an artist talk with Keith Harter tonight. For a little bit of a background, Ill Winds was actually supposed to be scheduled at the Art Gallery of St. Albert in April 2020. It was unfortunately the first exhibit we had to postpone and cancel because of the ongoing pandemic. And it is an act of beautiful symmetry that it is the first exhibition that we're able to reopen with this week after 6 long months of closures between the terrible second and third waves of COVID-19 in our province. And so I would like to thank Keith Harter very much for being so patient and accommodating as we've had to rearrange our schedules and all of our lives in the last little while. And so it is our absolute pleasure to bring you finally to the gallery and show your works off in person. And so we did just reopen for in-person visiting. If you are in the area, I do encourage you to stop by and take a look. But without further ado, I'll introduce Keith Harter. Most of you know him, but those of you don't. Keith has been a lifelong artist and creator and was a professor at the University of Alberta campus, the Augustana campus, for several decades. He's an illustrious painter. He's done land art pieces, had numerous solo shows and group exhibitions all across the country. And it is our delight to be able to host him tonight and listen to his wonderful talk. So Keith, without any further ado, if you'd like to take it away.
So, Paint It Black. The Ill Winds paintings were a tremendous deviation from my usual way of working. They are complicated paintings in how they are made. They are complicated in how they use ideas which are complicated in themselves. And it was a winding road of development getting to a successful realization. Therefore, it is difficult and unfair to talk about them as if they were simple matters. In order not to trivialize them, there are historical and theoretical elements I feel I must mention to contextualize this work. So, if the going gets thick at times, just take it as texture or background noise. We will all land up at the same place in the end, and I hope that those who can endure will be rewarded. I am under no illusion that you are a captive audience. Some of the obvious differences in these works are, first, that I used acrylic paint for the first time in over 40 years. Next, that they are far larger than any other painting I've ever done. Thirdly, inasmuch as they are metaphorical, they are not concerned with accurate descriptions of moments in time, which means that light and color are chosen for expressive purposes rather than for representational ones. Lastly, the technical process used in these creations is highly involved and extremely rare, if not unique. I want to start by skimming over a bit of the history and theory behind some of the ingredients that have gone into this production, and then explain more of the actual working methods. I do not intend to discuss meanings or interpretations beyond saying that these paintings wink at two ancient epigrams. The first, it's an ill wind that blows no one any good. And second, its counterpart, every cloud has a silver lining. So you can make of that what you will. But getting to the expressive effect alluded in those pithy sayings has engaged matters and mysteries of color and its perception. This business of seeing, and particularly of seeing color, gets taken for granted in our daily functioning, but it is a wonder to consider. It has been the subject of philosophical and scientific inquiry from early times of civilization. Aristotle and the Greek scholastics declared that color was a property of the object. And just like all the flat earth theorists, they felt they had obvious perceptual evidence on their side. Galileo later figured out that they had it all wrong, that color perception was actually a function of the observer. If no one sees the tree in the forest, it falls in black and white. In earlier times, art was central to the discussion around understanding the experience of the world. Plato declared that we know the world through form, and that color is just an enhancement. For many artists, this meant that the linear nature of form was a truer understanding of the world. Clear edges, as defined by a drawing approach, followed by shading in volumes and gradients. This approach was called disegno. For others, the truer approach to finding form lay in the massing of light and shadows as defined by color and treated by a painterly stroke. This position was called colorito. In the Renaissance, Michelangelo and the Florentines exemplified disegno, while Titian and the Venetians typified colorito. This is why those two sides of the panel there look different. In the Baroque age, Poussin and Rubens typified the poles of this discussion as well. In Northern Europe, a significant artistic interest concentrated on seeing as the way of knowing the world, and it was practiced as close observation. Now, this is a practice close to my heart. It is no coincidence that the development of lenses and the reevaluation of how the eye works happened there. Kepler's model of the eye was as a picture maker, the analogy being to a pinhole camera or a camera obscura, a device suspected of being in the service of artists like Vermeer. With Isaac Newton's treatise titled Optics and the inquiry into the mechanisms of the eye, the interest in color became more active. In the 18th century, color began being systematized into organizations of circles and wheels. The logic behind all of this was that vision actually starts with color and moves on to form. This suited the Romantic artists, for whom painting started with feeling and then moved on to form. The urge for systematization was even more acute in the 19th century, when the uses of color became much more diverse and urgent. The Industrial Revolution in chemistry made gains in pigment development and also in the development of light-sensitive surfaces. When coordinated with lenses, this revolutionized picture making, i.e., photography. Simultaneously, the uses of color became less associated with representing form and more associated with representing sensation and feeling. After all, photography originally was in black and white and captured form excellently. Now, this next little bit is only for those who like a little science with their art. If this does not appeal to you, you can just push it to the side of your plate and wait for the next course. The idea of primary colors, those irreducible colors that in mixing can give rise to other colors, is a staple of color wheel theory. The trichromatic theory of retinal receptor cells plays to this. This theory has the light detectors of the retina having short, middle, and long wavelengths, which correlate to red, green, and blue of the spectrum. Proportionate experiences of these wavelengths create all color experience. A different theory, called opponent processing, has cone receptors, photoreceptors, linked together to form three opposing color pairs. Activation of one member of the pair inhibits activity in the other. This plays to other color theories, notably that of Goethe. Each of these theories explains a lot about color experience, but never everything. For example, we can instantly understand colors in extremely varied lighting conditions through contextual cues. This is called color constancy. And our brain mastering color constancy has nothing to do with wavelength experience. This is why we teach simultaneous contrast in art foundation courses. What you see here in the middle of the left picture is a band of gray down the middle, and you notice how it looks darker at one end and lighter at the other, but it's the same gray throughout. The little dots of gray and the little dots of red triangles on the other side are constant in terms of their color, but they look different depending on what they're against. And again, going back to the left side, those vertical bands of color look like they are darker next to a light edge, lighter next to a dark edge. So you get that impression that it's fluted, but really it's the same color all the way across. The brain uses context and even forces context to make sense of the world. This is a hardwired survival mechanism, but artists need to be able to manage it effectively. For instance, will you accept the fact that the squares A and B are using the same color of paint? Your brain is an amazing thing. These theories would like to give us the comfort that lighting conditions interact with objects and that the eye and brain sorts it all out by translating wavelength information into colors. But the neurological and physical evidence that supports these models is extremely inconsistent. Frankly, we do not know exactly how it works in all cases. This gives us the opening to experiment, innovate, and improvise in visual expression. So the upshot of all this is, as we look at color systems, we must understand that they are more functional than they are truthful in absolute terms. And that is why color systems are so varied. They depend on what you want to do with the data, much like the particle wave problem in the nature of light itself. Originally, color wheels were devised to assist artists in mixing paint. But another driver also came from the world of biology, where naturalists were striving to standardize the color descriptions of insects or plants, for example. For painters, the color wheel consisted of an understanding that some colors, red, blue, and yellow, were irreducible, and that those, when mixed, could be used to create other colors, which in turn could be mixed adjacently to create intermediary colors. These were termed primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, respectively. The usefulness of this system is linked directly to the nature of pigments that give paint its color. But there is a problem with pigments that turns any color wheel discussion into a theoretical exercise. Pigments, being chemicals, only approximate singular wavelengths. They are not pure. The chemistry of artist paint is predicated on the principal value of color permanence. Pigments are required to not fade or shift so that such changes be minimal and that paintings be protected from the effects that change the character of the pigment. The chief one is ultraviolet light. The world of pigments has a history of bizarre sources for permanent chemicals. From the powdered semi-precious stone, lapis lazuli, to the distilled essence of certain beetles, to certain shellfish extract, to late extraction of madder roots, and would you believe at one point, ground up Egyptian mummies. Some sources are highly toxic, like arsenic, lead, and coal tar. And there are dangerous heavy metals like cadmium and cobalt. The scientific advances of late 19th century involved using cyanide, which is in most blue and green artists' paint now. One of my favorite pigments, manganese blue, had such toxic byproducts in its production that it has become illegal to produce. That is why it is important for artists to know which end of the brush they might be putting into their mouth. But one key thing for me was to understand pigments in terms of their transparency and how they played over each other and next to each other. All pigments reflect and absorb light wavelengths in different combinations, so that mixing them also mixes wavelengths that do not correlate to any predictive ambitions of a color wheel. There's a book in my library called Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green.
There we go.
It is dedicated to managing the incorrigibility of pigment mixing. The bottom line is that the paint color wheel is useful in a limited way, but needs to be noted that in other applications, color wheels look different because the media in question behaves differently. In color printing, the colors used are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And yes, black is not technically a color. But remember that color systems are pragmatic and not absolute. Black is there to make up for the imperfections in the pigments of printing ink. Color printing operates on a trust in optical mixing. Again, the principle that all color happens in the brain with sensory input that can be limited and even discrete. In this case, colors are printed in a matrix of dots with differing proportions and overlaid on each other to create the full color impression that we love. The awareness of optical mixing began with Isaac Newton spinning his color wheel fast enough to create an experience of whiteness. But it was really applied and investigated in the 19th century by the Impressionist artists, and more systematically by the artist George Seurat with his pointillist technique. You can think of these as analog pixels. There were, of course, epistemological and philosophical underpinnings to the color investigations undertaken by these artists, but that's a different discussion. Optical mixing became a widely applicable concept, from the granular nature of camera film to the triple electron gun approach in vintage color TV and computer monitors. And now we have the pixels of tripartite liquid crystal display and camera sensors. All these technologies depend on the red, green, blue color system that correlates to the trichromatic theory of color vision. The whole pixel business is almost commonplace now and is used in many cute and clever ways, from needlepoint to the Truman Show poster and Lego. The whole business of pixels is something we take for granted now, but it is still quite wondrous, and it really is not a very old technology. The big difference between paintings and printing on one hand and TV and computers on the other is the way colors mix. When you are using light sources of different kinds, you add wavelengths together. The more you add, the closer you get to white light. In paint, you are depending on the absorption of light by the material, thereby subtracting the light reflected to the eye. The more wavelengths you absorb, the blacker the color gets. For obvious reasons, these are called additive and subtractive systems. The ways of getting to black was very important for me for the Ill Winds project. In the 60s, the artist Chuck Close decided to deviate from conventional paint color theory. He was interested in the whole area of perceptual interpretation, and for one of his investigations, he tried to make paintings based on the visual experience of color printing. You can see the color separations on his easel there. Cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. Using an airbrush and transparent acrylic paint, he layered his paintings using only CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, as sourced from color separations of photographs. This is a non-pixelated optical mixing, which is an amazing accomplishment when you experience it. Here you can see a sequence of how these things are layered up and end up as a full color representation. His interest in perceptual processing took him into diverse forms of optical interpretation. And later in his career, his paintings took on much coarser appearances. It is a witty way to play on a viewer's mental processing. This is all good fun. But it was the use of transparent color layers in his early work that influenced the direction of my recent investigations. This is because I've always been interested in the powerful effects of the painting technique called glazing. This is a technique that has a long history in traditional representational painting. And for that very reason, it fell out of favor with modernists as well as postmodernists. It is rarely taught in visual art programs, certainly not in any institutions that subscribe to the current trend of de-skilling. Glazing can be thought of as analogous to staining a piece of wood. You affect the color, but the grain of the wood in all its character remains visible, as if you put a sheet of colored cellophane over it. Sometimes, like staining a deck, you just lay on the product and leave it. But when you stain furniture, you lay it on and wipe off the excess. This latter method is the way I use glazing. In earlier centuries, painters might paint the entire painting in neutral monotone, such as grays, and then add the color over top transparently. This separates the problems of form and color. Having managed the value gradients and the modeling of light and form in a tonal way, the management of color became easier, and the transparency gave a luminosity to the image that cannot be achieved in an opaque mix of paint. The underpainting in such an approach was called grisaille in France, or verdaccio in Italy, where green varieties were preferred, especially where skin tones were at issue. To be successful, this underlayer must be brought to a high state of resolution, as flaws can be visible in subsequent layers. A painter who was highly proficient at this was Ingres. He was discontented with one of his paintings and left it unfinished in the grisaille state. It hangs at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The completed version, in the Louvre, illustrates the amazing effect of glazing. Before 1998, I used glazes occasionally and in limited ways. But I took it on as a concentrated exercise when another artist took a portrait of me and essentially dared me to do something different with it. So, taking on the tonal underpainting method on one hand, and then a page from Chuck Close, I used transparent colors to come to this result. But perversely, I chose to use the color system of additive light in a subtractive way. I used blue, green, and red layers. And between each, I reiterated the highlights with a scumbling dry brush technique. A few colors were glazed in at the end. The color does not convey well in reproduction, but the darks in particular were vibrant. Although I used this approach to teach glazing scumbling in the classroom, I did not return to this method until starting the Ill Winds project. So the really big questions are, why would I do all of this? And why do it at this point? When this itch began, I had been painting a series of small works. This is part of an art world conversation that I have been engaging in and which I will not go into now. But during this, I read an article by Jed Pearl, the art critic for the New Republic. He intimated that the freshly minted artist Eleanor Ray, while being a virtuosic painter at a small scale, did not have the courage of her convictions to make more substantive work. Pearl wrote, "Ray brings a tightly controlled painterly panache to her itsy-bitsy glimpses of the view through a window or some empty shelves or a bicycle locked to a post. The sizes of the panels on which she paints, one is 2¼ inches by 2¾ inches, and the biggest is 5 by 7 inches, suggest a reverse hubris, a pride in how much she can do with so little. There is something about Ray's hunkered down facility that strikes me as symptomatic of a fearfulness that overtakes all too many serious painters today. As much as I worry about the power of the trash meisters who now dominate so many of our galleries and museums, I worry more about an atmosphere that makes it so difficult for painters who are actually engaged with the possibilities of brushes and pigments to feel free." End of quote. There are good reasons to paint small, so critiquing scale as such can be an unfair comment, since some work needs the intimacy of close-at-hand views. But taking it as a challenge, I wondered, if I am a serious painter and engaged with the possibilities of pigments and brushes, what might I do at a large scale? It is not just a question of enlarging an image. Images have appropriate sizes for what they need to do, and a monumental size of something small will function very differently as an audience experience. I began to imagine what subject might suit a large-scale painting, and what logistical efforts would it take. Knowing that I could paint in the large university studio classroom over the summer almost meant that I had a responsibility to attempt something. The question of physically handling large scale in terms of materials, as well as shipping and storage, never mind exhibition, had to be worked out ahead of time. I devised and fabricated a system for assembling and stretching a canvas that could be taken apart for shipping and storage, and sort of easily reassembled, but it is not IKEA. And none of this could ever have happened without the financial assistance from the University of Alberta Research Office, who funded it. But in terms of content, I had recently been considering the work of Robert Longo, who came to international recognition for his large-scale works of business executives in unbalanced and sometimes falling poses. These are exclusively black and white because they are made with charcoal. They are quite large. He has gone on to make other kinds of images, and I invite you to detect an underlying theme in the diversity of this work. His subjects can include the natural and wild world, or social and technological worlds, but the content lurks beneath. These are large images and need to be for the sake of making the content impactful. Simultaneously, I had also been thinking of an old-fashioned idea from the world of aesthetic experience. That is the sublime. Like the word awesome, this is a term that has become somewhat trivialized in modern times. Originally, it did not include beauty in its artistic implications, but rather an experience that overwhelms with implications that could include fear, terror, or grandeur, likely with an accompanied anxiety. Longo's use of blackness resonated with me, and especially in this context. Let's just go back. So like a classic detective novel, the case of the ill winds has means, motive, and opportunity. Here is a review of the raw ingredients that I tried to mix into this solution. Number one, the awareness of the way color acts in our brain, particularly the three-color theory. Number two, the knowledge of how pigments behave with each other, especially transparency. Number three, the techniques of glazing over a tonal ground and the layering of transparent color. Number four, the expressive attraction of darkness and particularly blackness. Number five, the challenge to use monumental scale effectively. Number six, the practice of close observation and description. Number seven, the use of the sublime as a feature of content. And number eight, a spacious studio, a system of construction, and time. The big question was, what subject might it take on to make it work? Subject matter carries content. So it was a critical issue. I decided to re-engage a subject that has been a recurring motif throughout my career, that of skies, and in particular, thunderhead clouds. Did you know that Alberta has the hail capital of the world? It is a band of real estate extending east from the foothills between High River and Ponoka. We get great, dangerous clouds here, and danger was an element I wanted to include. Treating them with high contrast tone was an intriguing idea, but I thought that using just black and white paint would be too simplistic for a painting and rather flat in a deadening way. As I was casting about for other ways of getting to a richer and resonant black, I recalled the earlier self-portrait and my RGB subtractive system. However, using that technique on a large scale in the medium of oil paint would be prohibitively expensive and toxic. So I had to see whether it could be done in acrylic. This 36-inch square canvas was the prototype. I found that developments in acrylic paint, including glaze medium, fluid acrylic, and slow drying acrylic, had been developed in the years since I used it in junior undergraduate courses. What I expected was that I would arrive at a black and white painting in which the layers of colors would essentially cancel each other out. What actually happened was surprising and much more interesting. Certainly the darks were deeper and more luminous, but the highlights did not turn gray except at a distance due to optical mixing. Upon closer examination, colors sparkled across the highlights in different ways, and the highlights themselves took on a projected luminosity. This, in effect, creates a very different visual experience, and one that lends it possibilities for layered interpretations. I decided to do a series of 4 paintings titled after the 4 winds. The number 4 is an archetypal number that relates to all sorts of cultural systems, from suits of cards, the seasons, the body humors, alchemical elements, the horsemen of the apocalypse, the cardinal directions, not to mention the Alberta Ballad by Ian Tyson. The series is called Ill Winds, and it trades on the 4 cardinal directions, north, east, west, and south. The first painting in the Ill Winds series was the North Wind. It unfolded in this sequence. I chose a warm gray for my grisé, straight burnt umber. The painting is an 11-tone value map, including black and white. The tonal overpainting, a wet in wet technique, is the most time-consuming stage, measuring weeks. Glazing happens very quickly. in minutes rather than days. Even with a drying retarder, acrylic glaze must be slopped on and ragged off quickly before things get sticky. The process of scumbling back the highlights takes days again. For the north painting, I used a sequence of green, and then red, and then finally blue. Each of the 4 paintings uses a different sequence of color. I finished North and started West Wind in the summer of 2015 and had to put it away for the term. I finished it the following summer of 2016 and prepared the final 2 canvases for the South and East Winds, which you can see here. In the winter of 2017, I acquired a smaller private studio with only 8-foot ceilings. So the East Wind had to be painted on its side. The West Wind painting process was photographed from beginning to end with a time-lapse system taking shots at an interval of 20 seconds. These have been edited into a 7-minute film that demonstrates the process and the effects of this painting approach. On average, there are 50 frames per second. I will conclude the presentation with this film and hope that all this talk informs what you will be experiencing. You will see that the work happens in stages. First, the construction of the canvas ground with an aluminum frame, then the rough underpainting, followed by a lengthy grisaille underpainting. In the midst of the grisaille stage, you will see that the painting had to be dismantled and stored for the fall and winter school terms, then assembled and started again the next spring. Then follows several layers of glazing and scumbling and the highlights that bring the work to a conclusion.
These works are going to be on display at the Art Gallery of St. Albert until Friday, July 30th, and so there's still lots of time to come see them. We have opened our doors again to in-person viewing. It's going to be Tuesday to Friday from 1 until 5 p.m. and then Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. If it's possible, they are absolutely worth the trip, and I do highly encourage that. And I'm only a little bit biased because I think these are amazing pieces that I've been waiting about 2 years to exhibit in person. So thank you so much for joining us.